So welcome everyone. My name is Michael Llewellyn. I am the head of solutions architecture at Open Zeppelin. That's an unofficial way to say I have an approximate knowledge of many security things, including occasionally AVS. We had a panel on oracles earlier and how to manage it in lending protocols, and now let's talk a little bit about how we do so in restaking. So I do have some of Tarun's questions here, so I am going to try to, as a layman who's probably not going to go nearly as deep as he am, I'm going to rely on the expertise of our lovely panelists here. Maybe before I get into some of the deep questions, I'll just give everyone a chance to just quickly go around. Maybe the first person who wants to start with just like a quick TLDR, about what are we looking like in the future of oracles in terms of AVS? What are some exciting areas? Who's the Eigen layer guy? Okay, perfect. Let's start with you. What are the use cases we're seeing with AVS and oracles? Why is this exciting? What are some other questions I should come up with on the panel? But no, not the last one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting to think about what oracles could and couldn't be in just like the restaking paradigm together. I actually think you're probably the best to answer this question about kind of the sprawling landscape of oracles in general. So I'll let you kind of define what those specific things are. As you start looking at those, but I'll let you go first on oracles.
I'm happy to do that. So when you think about restaking, everyone mainly think about the stake, about the capital itself. But oracles actually care about two main things. It's not just the capital, but it's also how can you create a system that it's very hard for the participants to coordinate. So who is actually managing this capital and operating behind this capital is as important as the amount of capital that you have. So right here you have these two aspects of it. Now, you also can break it to the type of security again into two, in between the budget of security, and Vitalik had some kind of a blog about that back in 2020, that the perfect oracle have separation between the budget of security and the cost of security, where the budget should be very, very high, but you have to obtain it, the value in it is that you have to obtain a lot of capital in order to affect the oracle, while this budget is not punishable. And then you have another part of security, which is the cost of capital, that part is actually punishable, and you kind of have a dual staking mechanism. And restaking really enable you to do both. You not just inherit the budget of security from Ethereum, the largest pool of security that we know of, but you also starting to inherit the validator set. We are in the early stages of that. We have just a few hundred operators in Eigen today. I'm not sure that at this stage we really need more than that, and that's by far more than any oracles have today as they operate, but I think that in the future this part will be as important and meaningful as the stake.
Tarun, would you like to take the helm?
Sorry. Hey everyone, sorry I'm very late. Where were you last question-wise?
We just started. The first and last question was just explaining for me, who just jumped on this panel, what is exciting about AVS.
Yes, all right. So I think one natural kind of question about, well, I guess you actually answered the first question, which is why is restaking good for Oracle? So maybe a second question that is worth kind of looking at is the word Oracle has had many meanings at least since I was in crypto. It's changed in meaning a lot. I think Bitcoin maxis would have a certain type of definition of Oracle only for hedging hash contracts. It's probably 2015 definition. The 2017 definition was, you had Oracleize and then eventually Chainlink, which would give you some TLS signature you could verify potentially. But generally, they were giving you point estimates. They were saying, here at this point in time, this off-chain data equals scalar value. Now, over time, obviously, the markets got more complicated. They provide a lot more data now. It's not just point estimates. They provide historical values. They provide confidence intervals. So I guess it would be great to hear from you what you think of an oracle right now. I think in 2024, oracles probably include co-processing at the limit of like doing arbitrary computation, but then there's obviously the stuff that has tons of latency and bandwidth constraints, like point estimates of prices. But the spectrum has grown. So kind of walk me through what you would define as an oracle today in 2024.
Yeah, so from my standpoint, I think there's a natural tendency to take a term that's defined in crypto and then take a new architecture and try to impose that onto the term, or impose that within the umbrella of what that term encompasses. The concern I have is that I think oracles are a very well-defined product in crypto that has PMF in the context of price feeds for a lot of DeFi protocols. I think coprocessors are something that's in many ways dissimilar from an oracle. Where an oracle's function is to bring exogenous off-chain data on-chain, the job of a coprocessor is to extend the execution of a blockchain to allow it to do something over its own state, or a state that's committed on it, that is more computationally intensive than what can currently run in it. And so I actually think there are two separate categories, right? I think of a coprocessor much more of an extension of the virtual machine, where an oracle is in many ways a data feed, a way to bring exogenous off-chain data on-chain. So what I would actually now put as a new architecture under oracles would be zk-TLS protocols, which I think get at many of the same use cases as oracles, but do so in a way that enables more privacy over the data.
I actually have a question for you on that. Like,
Yeah.
do you think, as people look at coprocessors and oracles differently, are there people trying to grab both parts of that stack and kind of jam them together to basically sell together to certain clients, or do you feel like there's a natural value to them being separated?
I think there's a natural value for them being separated because from an engineering standpoint, you generally require two separate problems to be solved. Right? You have to build efficient computation over data, and then you have to build a trust-minimized way to bring data from an off-chain context on-chain. So I think it's a very natural point of partnership between zk-TLS companies and coprocessor companies, but because it would typically require two separate networks to be done efficiently, and I can talk more about that if that's helpful at all, I don't think it makes sense to co-opt them into one design. So to give a very simple example, Opacity, a team that I think very highly of, is one that we are going to be working closely with using our coprocessor over data that they bring on chain, but it's very much a relationship between two companies instead of something we'd ever bring in-house.
Yeah, the reason I ask is like it's as the business side of the AVS team and Eigenlayer, I see fucking everything. Like I see them jammed together, I see them separated, I see value props for both. We see like oracles that are very oriented around price feeds. It's all they do. We see oracles that are very oriented around trust assumptions, and then with like the intersubjective component of this of, hey, can we all agree that this thing actually happened? It completely exposes a new set of oracles that I think are relatively interesting. So I'm always curious kind of how that value prop is actually going to expand, whether it's going to contract into one client doing it, or it's going to be multiple that are solving the same problem.
Yeah, I mean, one reason I ask this question is, in general, the way oracles are being used now is way more complicated, and actually the on-chain compute for enforcing constraints between the different oracle feeds is done sort of either off-chain or coprocessor, or in the case of like, Pyth or Chainlink, some off-chain aggregation step, which is basically doing some potentially arbitrary computation. In fact, a lot of the Oracle networks will offer you sort of like AWS Lambda style functions, which is like, we'll run this function on your Oracle and report f of price to you, which is not that different, right? And my point is like the definition of Oracle has just been this like moving target over time. So like getting a estimate from each person, because like each of you has a different vantage point of like what people call an oracle right now.
Maybe I'm being a stickler for semantics, but I would even call a lambda function over an exogenous price feed. I wouldn't call that a coprocessor. I'd consider that just a zkVM or some prover that you're using.
Sure. Yeah.
I think the way I'd look at it is an oracle is something that does off-chain, that brings off-chain data on-chain. A coprocessor is something that computes over on-chain data. Both can be built using a zkVM or some type of proving system, but they're very much different architectures and they solve different problem statements.
I'll add that like from a security auditor perspective, which is how we've dealt with oracles, I just think of this as it's a trust assumption that I don't get to include in my analysis when I say how the smart contract operates. If this can change the security properties of the smart contract, but there's no deterministic way to verify it, like I'm just trusting that something off-chain is going to push this data or provide this data in some format. Usually it's just price feeds for like a lending market. It's something that we're just going to have to assume is going to operate correctly, along with maybe multi-sigs or governance or other things like that. That's how we always have to think about it. Is just we just hope it works. The rest of the code, that's in scope. We hope we get it right. But oracles are like just way out there, and something that smart contract developers are usually just going to have to make the right assumption on, and come down to trusting provider. Like the blue chip, I hope Chainlink works, is kind of like the mantra of most lending protocols that we talked about in the last panel.
Yeah, I guess in general, if you think of the Oracle as like an app chain, also the node operators, they get the price feed data from some API or somewhere. Like you get assigned a certain API from some exchange, and then like you could do anything with that data in between before you report it back into your Chainlink node and then bring it out. So theoretically, you have that implicit trust into the node operator that they compute what they were like sort of opted into. And currently, most of that is like completely off-chain or governance-based, right? Like for the leading oracles. Even like Pyth, I think the only one that has like some form of slashing live with the data feeds is like fully subjective, and there's some sort of like governance-based committee that then decides, okay, you kind of misreported over this certain period, and they write down like a sort of, this is what you should do, but yeah, in practice, it's very hard to slash for this. Notoriously, we all know that. So yeah, I guess not sure if there's much point in trying to tell it apart. I guess you always compute over some data somehow, maybe.
For sure. I think like things that you're validating a state root versus things you just trust are definitely different. But as oracles get more complicated, people are merging the two a lot, right? They're like, I get a price feed. If the price is in some range, then I touch this piece of code, then you need to prove that this computation on this piece of code is correct. Now it's actually too big for the blockchain, so we're doing that off-chain in some way. And so my point is just more like, I think these things are interacting so much that people will offer them together over time. I mean, do you think that's true?
That's actually a very interesting point. So when I look at the difference between a coprocessor and a oracle, let's say if I have a proof for this, what would the public input be? And the public input to a proof of a coprocessor would just effectively be, here is the block header of a chain at the point of time that I'm verifying this proof. So it shouldn't in any way materially affect if the circuits aren't broken, and if there's no liveness loss with the coprocessor, it shouldn't affect the function of the application. It shouldn't introduce any additional security risk. Obviously, with an off-chain data source, that's entirely different because you're relying on the validity of the actor bringing that data on-chain. But if you're chaining together a coprocessor action, or an oracle feed into a coprocessor action, to your point, then you can say across that entire unit, you're now predicating the coprocessor on not the block header of the chain, but the block header of the chain that includes some exogenous state. So it's actually very interesting where the two things, if they're directly chained together, lose the property that the data that's being computed over has an assurance of authenticity since it's the block header from the execution client.
Yeah, I just think like if you look at code bases, you're starting to see people do this more. I think especially whenever people talk about doing these like T-based DeFi calculations, you effectively see something that looks like this, and I think also with ZK. So it just seems to me there's going to naturally be this synergy, but maybe let's move towards something Felix brought up, which is slashing. Slashing in oracles is wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Maybe it exists when people are kind of paying attention. But in restaking, I think the slashing is going to be much more of a first-class citizen for oracles. So, in a lot of ways, this will give consuming protocols some better guarantees from a risk standpoint. So what do you think some of the biggest improvements to oracles with slashing will be, and how do you think the AVS versions of these will, and network and service versions of these will compare with the kind of the current versions where there's Pythnet as a centralized aggregator or Chainlink's centralized off-chain aggregator?
Well, everyone agreed that this is a complex thing, and I think that now when slashing will be enabled, the number one thing that most node operators mainly care about won't be just how much do I make, is do you expose me to any risk? And AVSs that will have slashing will definitely see completely different behavior from the node operators. I do think that there is a big value proposition if you are not just telling a dApp, I'm protecting you and I have slashing if something bad is happening, rather than if something bad is happening, there is an amount of capital that you can look as an insurance, that you can actually receive back. If you're able to guarantee something like that to dApps, this is a big value proposition that is better than anything else that exists in the market. Because most of the dApps that use in Chainlink today don't care that Chainlink don't have slashing because they trust the brand. And the fact that Pete started doing the slashing with a committee probably don't, like, I would assume that most dApps don't really care much about that. But at the moment that you can tell dApp, hey, this is the pool of capital that maybe will not cover 100% of the TVL that you have in your protocol, but according to these rules, if you are able to prove that, you're actually going to get some capital back. And I think that will be a big improvement. Now, with that being said, as I said earlier, you have to think how you're doing it without really touching the budget of security. Because you're not going to be able, I think no AVS will be able to slash $10 billion. It's just something that's probably won't going to happen in the foreseeable future. But when you have dual staking, and you can...
If someone slashes $10 billion, that's definitely like an on-chain financial crisis, just as a heads up.
There is a question, what do you mean by slashing? Where this capital goes, right? Where this capital goes to, because Eigen cannot really do it, like not real slashing, you just move it somewhere. So, and of course, Eigen have the committee, and these things were like, I think I remember from the very, very early days, these were the things that Shriram were always referring to and explaining on. We want to make sure that we never get to that point. But going back to like the foreseeable future, I think that the dual staking mechanism and the fact that you're going to have a native token for AVSs that can be used and can be enforced in slashing will really allow this direct insurance in a way, something that was not exist for oracles up until now.
Yeah, and a couple things on that. So first of all, $10 billion slashed. I think a lot of this is going to be solved with the concept of total stake versus unique stake, which is a lot of what you're talking about. And for people that don't know, the whole concept is that total stake is anti-Sybil. It's pie in the sky, everything that's in Ethereum or in Eigen layer or Symbiotic. Unique stake is the concept of slashable stake, right? So I think what's really interesting, at least when I think about like your question specifically, is how operators begin to differentiate themselves in these kind of markets, right? Because when you introduce slashing, the concept of where those rewards go that should have been gone to that operator that basically slashed, when you can start redistributing those rewards accordingly, you start looking at a like far more differentiated operator, right? Because if you are between 15 different operators in Solana, they all have pretty much the same reward rate, unless they're doing something pretty exotic. But in this kind of world, right, if you have an operator that's really, really high quality liveness, is doing all the right things, is providing correct price feeds, and someone else gets slashed for doing a shitty job, the ability to redistribute that will inherently make operators that are operating at the highest octave better, right, and make them a higher reward rate. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that kind of plays out as slashing and redistribution becomes allocated within these systems for restaking.
Felix?
The question was how AVS make oracles better, basically?
Or no, more like how restaking slashing rules make oracles better versus like the existing like sort of either token-based slashing or governance-based slashing, because in some sense you have stronger guarantees, right? So what does that buy you as the customer?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess there's, for me, from restaking, what you really get is like the higher capital efficiency, the bigger pool of capital available for slashing. Almost, I don't know if anything else fundamentally changed about oracles from this. Maybe I'm wrong. But what I see the actual oracles do so far is predominantly that this aggregation function where there is already the step you take from the off-chain data source, and then the aggregation is done like as a AVS. So it's basically like, okay, and that is slashable if the aggregation isn't done in the correct way. But the step before, where you sort of go from the API and all that assignment is actually unslashable. So I don't actually know if that's doable even in the long run, and maybe you just need to trust the node operators there, or have some sort of like intersubjective slashing on that spot. But I see that a lot of the the sort of staking and slashing actually comes into play more on this aggregation level to like finally push it on chain. I think one interesting observation also has been from Chainlink, like also like having run Chainlink operator in the past. Like there's a lot of uncertainty, I guess, in the gas price you pay for pushing your price on chain as an operator. And like basically how Chainlink handled that is like sort of off-chain repaying the operators afterwards, and it's like all this like whole governance and like off-chain mess. I would love to see that becoming more on-chain, maybe through like options on or gas price subscriptions and stuff like that, actually making this a more fully on-chain process overall. This is like not really about slashing, but I think that I see like many improvements to be made there to like just bring more of what currently is handled like off-chain through like agreements and contracts just on chain there. I think that there's like a big space there to be improved if you're building an Oracle.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think one area that I really just want to highlight that I think is significant here is capital efficiency, right? Like the amount that you have to pay for an oracle is going to be proportionate to the cost of capital of the stake used to underpin that oracle. And so if you have a network that uses some third party or some proprietary token of a company that has a cost of capital or hurdle rate of like 10, 15% like we see in Cosmos networks, or like, you know, the high single digits percent as we see in a lot of more mature POS systems, it means that per year the network has to charge an amount proportionate to that cost of capital times the amount of stake that it has underpinning that. The good thing about restaked ETH is that the expectation of return on that is heavily covered by the base layer. So it means that, you know, if 50 bips, 25 bips, 1% is sufficient for a lot of these networks to incentivize a very large amount of total stake, and then it has to pay for unique stake insofar as it can offset the marginal risk that the slashing condition it imposes. And so it just means overall the system's much cheaper, and I think it means you can have much larger pools of capital underlaying a lot of these oracles, that it is in fact slashable, and is in fact slashable in a secure way.
Yeah, I think one of the, to your point, I think the main difference from the perspective of the end user is, you know, when you're a link operator, well, first off, there wasn't even really like link staking then probably at that time, right? And like the cost of acquisition for becoming a staker is higher. B, the fact that you don't have some remnant yield to fall back to of the raw staking yield. And then C, I think people care when they get slashed in ETH. Like if I get slashed in of a low liquidity coin where the amount the slash is like the same price as my market impact if I had to sell that amount, then I'd value it less than ETH where like I don't actually pay that much in impact cost. So like if I wanted to exit the network, my entry and exit fee is lower. So I think in because of that, people value the slashes more, but they also value lower amounts of rewards higher. So I think in a lot of ways, to me, that's always been like the kind of golden dream of restaked oracles. So you know, a natural other question is, you know, and this is a me giving a much more heuristic kind of summary, but to me, one of the ways you can view an AVS is as a blockchain that has irregular updates, in that the AVS doesn't have to conform to periodic blocks writing an update. It actually can have this irregular update whenever there is a need for an update. So this naturally gives you a reason to have oracles between AVSs, where one AVS sort of is able to say like, hey, this property happened to me at time 100, and another AVS that is live, that has its next event processed at time 137, will receive that when time 137 happens. Another one that has it processed at time 160 will receive it at time 160. So there's sort of a sense in which AVSs share a common bulletin board if necessary from the L1, but they also could communicate directly with one another. And there's sort of a natural space in which you would imagine that there will be oracles for that if these services get big enough. So what do you kind of think about kind of oracles for applications on rollups and mainnet versus oracles actually between AVSs and how that might evolve?
So I'm going to take a very risky answer and say I actually don't think you need oracles between AVSs, because I don't think that I think that one AVS can actually communicate in its current function with a different AVS. it can call a node in that AVS and reach its own agreement over its whatever signature it's going to do over the data of a secondary AVS. So the need of a third-party service that sits between two AVSs might not have to happen. Because in theory, if you're, like the reason that a blockchain would need an oracle is because it can't effectively have a node make an external API call to a non-deterministic source. So otherwise, we wouldn't be able to reach consensus over that. But by nature of being an off-chain system, you can actually make an API call to a non-deterministic source over some threshold of what you're going to reach your agreement on. So if my AVS needs to make a call to Matan's AVS about some value within some range, it can effectively do that without needing a third-party service to sit in the middle and bridge the state between the two of them.
I think what Tarun is saying is also not just between AVSs, but between an AVS and, let's say, Ethereum. So what if you have a change in the operator set? Someone is withdrawing, and you want to be able to reflect that in a trustless way. But this AVS is actually a different blockchain that is doing something that is not really an Oracle base. And now it needs a way to reflect this change in the operator set, because if not, you're going to have some kind of operators that are active but don't really have stake, which you don't want that. I forget what was the name of it. It's like not the undead,
You just mean operators who are like in a withdrawal queue, zombie,
yeah, the zombie problem. But how do you reflect that? So this AVS can just, say, hey, I'm doing it in a completely centralized way, and I'm managing these updates constantly, or I'm relying on some way of communication. And now you have a question of, are we going to see in the future where in 2 years' time from now, you have, let's say, I don't know, 10%, 20% of the amount of dApps actually as AVSs on different restaking platforms? If that's the case, there is definitely a space for that. But it's really, I think it's a question of how many new AVSs are we going to see? And I think that's probably the most interesting question in crypto, of how many new use cases are we going to see? How many new applications? Like, we can talk about the difference between like core processor and Oracle and all of this very infrastructure kind of conversation that users won't care about that. We care about that, and we can go into these differentiations. But we are in the beginning of a bull market, and everyone cares about what are the next use cases. Are we going to see
What are the next tokens? Does everyone care?
When are the
All
next
right,
tokens?
Felix, it sounds like you have an answer.
No, I was more, I thought like to have communication between two different off-chain systems, I guess you need to put some information on some global shared ledger, right? So I'm not sure if you can
You
compete.
fall back to that, right?
fall back.
Optimistically,
Exactly,
right?
optimistic. Okay.
Yeah. You could argue, think about it this way. Like, I can certainly bridge between two rollups by entering a withdrawal queue of one and depositing in the deposit contract of another, but that's slow, right? So in general, a lot of the bridging protocols you could effectively view as sort of fast path oracles for moving between things. But with rollups, there's regular blocks. Like, they're like a blockchain. There's some periodicity. But with AVSs, there's not necessarily periodicity. There might be these quiescent periods where there's no update for a long time, and then suddenly a burst of updates, right? And so because of that, you have to actually think a little bit. It might look different,
Right.
which is...
I think, like, I'm familiar with sort of this, in Solana you have the cranking, right, or the keeper
exactly.
networks in Ethereum already, which seems similar to what you described, where basically some off-chain system observes the chain state and then calls some smart contract to update it when it hits a certain thing. Would that be an AVS in your...
So I guess the question though is like, will AVSs develop their own communication networks? Like, will these applications need to talk to each other in the way that we already see that rollups have to talk to each other, and then people have like built kind of kludgy things, like the message passing bridges are slow versus the kind of like bridges that require keepers are fast, right? Like, there are all these trade-offs, but I think the question is, imagine there's a world where there's 5 AVSs. AVS 1 has $10 million of revenue a year, AVS 2 has 5 million, and the rest are all 1 million. Like, they each have some economic value, and they may actually get higher economic value from communicating with one another. Do you think that world will happen where there's actually a lot of inter-AVS communication, and will oracles mediate that?
So to look at...
I hope so.
I think it will, but to go back to your example of rollups, I'll say it counterpoints like the superchain, right? Where you effectively don't need an external interop protocol between a superchain because there's just an implicit agreement.
Does this interop protocol exist in the
It's in
room
the
or
room,
on the
yes.
chain with us?
No, but I'm saying the idea being you just have my rollup runs a full node of your rollup, and your rollup runs a full node of my rollup, and then we can communicate without a third-party service. And so if I have an RPC connection in my off-chain component to yours, and vice versa, we don't really need a third-party service to bridge the information between us. It's the level of the centralization of each system and the requirements for determinism within each system that require a third-party system that's fine without determinism to operate between it, right? Because there's no determinism between off-chain calls and on-chain states. We get an oracle to bridge between that. And between my service and your service, we can simply just connect via RPC, is I think how I see the architecture maturing.
Or the Restaking platform can also provide one. And I think that Eigen worked on that in the early days, even on like aggregation of certain things that are anyway coming from multiple AVSs and going to mainnet. And that was more on the efficiency, on let's say, how do you send BLS signatures? And I think this type of things would definitely help some AVSs that wouldn't want to build these things themselves.
Yeah, it definitely feels like something that would be built. I don't know if it would necessarily be a third party as much as it would be something that we would do basically just to assist in these kind of connections. Like what you're talking about, and if you know which connections you're trying to make in between these different AVSs, that's incredibly valuable. If you're using your use case of like 5 AVSs, then yeah, you can probably just run all this shit yourself and not really have to worry about it. I think if you're talking about this world where there's hundreds of AVSs, all of which have PMF in some way or another, you don't even know who they really are. You might not have those connections to basically go, hey, I need to connect with these guys or these guys. Like EigenLayer or Symbiotic doing that, I think, can provide a lot of value. I would imagine people are going to build it. Like there will be a third party that identifies the problem before we think it's actually needed to be solved. And the question is, at that point is, like, do we just believe that that works better than what we could build, or believe it's not a problem that we need to solve, right? But my hope is that we get to a point that it needs to be solved, and I think that would be a great problem for us to have if there was that many successful AVSs to do
For
that.
sure. I'm not saying like, hey, tomorrow we need this interop protocol, because like obviously for rollups we've seen that's taken like 5 years longer than everyone promised. But I guess the reason I'm asking this is like, in some ways, if I think about the economy for AVS and restaking, like how much more value do you think these ecosystems have when you are able to really like have bundles of AVS, like microservices? Like if I treat each AVS as a microservice, right? Like in normal tech, there's kind of this like Coasian limit where like, yeah, service, like products that use up to some number of microservices, like 10, generally work well. Once they get above that threshold, the communication becomes way too hard. How do you kind of view that within restaking? Like, is there some sort of limit of like, you know, how much people will bundle together AVSs versus not? I think from the Oracle standpoint, everyone is probably going to bundle with an Oracle, right? They if they're, say, a protocol that needs some off-chain data, so there's naturally a pairing of AVSs that exists. But what do you guys think about like a carrying capacity for like clusters of AVSs? Because, you know, again, if you look at things like Uber started by like, you know, when they blew up their microservice stack famously, like they turned everything into a microservice, had like 10,000 microservices, and then it shrunk back down to like around 50 to 100. So I'm kind of curious how you think this works when you compare to those kind of trad service analogies.
Oh, I mean, I don't have a good, but my mental model would be like a little bit like sort of this gadgets for rollups approach, like whatever your rollup can run in terms of like how many different AVSs like service it as like a sort of middleware, and then you can sort of align them with restaking. I think that would be sort of my model, but I don't know if there's like a limit to that in terms of, I guess, whatever the gas limit of the rollup is, and what would there? Yeah, I'm not sure. If
Yeah, I mean, I would inherently like. The hard thing is first of all, I think the forcing function right now is the quality of those bundles and having AVSs that we believe are mature enough to go out and actually like win clients over the course of a long time horizon. We've gone through this exercise of like which AVSs do we bundle together to present to a lending market or to present to a like a new type of DEX that's coming out, right? And those are normally between that 5 and 10 like different use cases that we could basically present and bundle together. And how those guys talk to each other, I think, is actually the really opaque and difficult part as we go and present a solution to someone, as we go up the stack and start thinking about that. But my overall perception is I think there's probably in my head 20 to 25 verticals of AVSs that I can like actually put my head on and go, okay, these are the actual verticals. This is where people sit within the market. And I really struggle to see a world where you can bundle more than every single vertical and not just have one specific one or two or three that actually present within those verticals.
I actually want to ask like a naive question there, because I think you mentioned lending markets, and so I'm thinking about this from the context of Compound. We're using Chainlink, and it's just super simple. We're just kind of unfortunately like relying on Chainlink never going down or having any issues. Would AVSs in these contexts, are these areas where they're going to compete, where they're going to say, hey, we can do what Chainlink does but better in some metric? Or is it going to be in like use cases that just weren't enabled or that Chainlink doesn't want to mess with? Because if you were to approach me, or a Compound, I shouldn't say. I work for Compound as a security provider. It gets messy sometimes. But like, is that going to be something you think? Yeah. Occasionally. Sometimes, like, are you guys going to say like AVSs are going to compete directly with Chainlink in what you're describing, like almost like the best way to compete there would be like literally replicate the Chainlink interface and make it as seamless as possible? Or is it going to be like, no, we have an entirely new way of doing this that you should adopt too because it's going to be better because of what AVSs allow?
It's both. My intention is, in like the reason I joined Rio and then Eigenlayer is because I fundamentally believe that restaking is going to readjust how people see like each of these independent services within these applications. I think if Chainlink isn't willing to build an AVS, isn't willing to identify that there is like a heavily like there's a real problem here, then our intention is to not only rip and replace that service, but also provide other use cases that might be outside of that scope of service. And my perception is that once we have AVSs that are ready, like we're on board to go out and do that.
Yeah, I feel like Matan probably should also answer.
Yeah.
So, and I also think this is connected very well to your next question. So almost all oracles today in the space are using the Chainlink interface. So for the DApp is basically they consume the data in the same way. And if you look what actually happening behind the scenes is you have a group of validators that are pulling data, again, from the same sources. So all of the oracles are pulling data from the same sources and are just trying to say, all right, our system will do that in the most trusted way. So there will be a conduit, and you can trust this conduit. Like, Pit is a bit...
Not degen chain, apparently. Sorry, that was a bad pun.
Pit doing it a bit differently, because Pit's saying, instead of getting it from this agreed data sources like Binance and all of the aggregators and all of the big exchanges, they're saying, we have all kind of professional trading firms that might be better than the source itself, or might put more power in the hands of like the new sources right now. But in essence, that's what you have. And now, what was just described here, and what I think connected very well to probably your next question, is do we actually want a future where you have these third parties that are just legacy third parties that require trust in them? They don't give any trust guarantees. Everyone knows that it's being managed by one, probably in Chainlink is one person multisig, but in many other oracles it's few people multisig. And
are you thinking of that? Do you guys remember the meme from last cycle where it was like 16 or 9 pictures of CZ and it was like pick, and it was like, like a CAPTCHA, and it was like pick the BNB validators?
So if we all live in a future where builders don't choose to build L1s anymore, everyone pretty much agree on the fact that the right way is to build an L2 because you don't need to bootstrap security, and you can just focus on actually what you're trying to build and on the use cases, on whatever. Why wouldn't that be the same with all of the other trust assumptions that we have, from oracles to bridges to everything, all of these things that we mentioned that are useful and important in the industry. And I think that this is pretty much where you start.
I have a very quick comment to make. I actually would agree with your stance on this one, related to kind of the security conscious nature of major on-chain dApps. insofar as the companies that we are familiar with that are around today that have lasted cycles, multiple cycles, take very cautious approaches for integrating new technology, specifically when the trust assumptions of that technology are opaque. And this is why I'm always very concerned, like when a lot of teams say, oh, you know, we're all going to sell to these DeFi apps. Because like the time it takes for a DeFi app to embrace a new technology is quite large. And even new apps building on this stack, like when I hear a new developer come to me and say, hey, here are the 15 things I'm going to build on off-chain to build my new DEX, I get worried because I'm like, there's a technical risk on all of those, there's an implementation risk, and there's go-to-market timeline complexities that are created. I typically think that the sales processes that are some of the most compelling, they identify a very specific problem that can have a low-risk solution being implemented for an existing large protocol, and then it builds something hyper-tailored to that problem, and when it succeeds at it, it can expand into adjacent problems with the requisite trust that is built from that. And so like with some of the DeFi protocols we work with, like we really try to find like one little thing, maybe in a yield-bearing token, maybe in a new feature they want to build, maybe in an already off-chain point system that's separate from their core logic, and we try to sell to that thing, and then when that works, we can expand.
If you can come up with like a good price feed for LSTs, LRTs that has proof of reserves built in, that would be very interesting. Because that's an area where it's already a little bit risky. The current, for the most part, the current price feeds don't have support for that. You can get the exchange rate, you can get the market rate, but you're not going to get anything with proof of reserves built in. That's where things would be interesting. But yeah, at the end of the day, like, I mean, throw in a DAO on top of the decision-making process of an internal team, and you have a very, very slow process for doing interesting new things.
That's in the works.
But if someone built that and you used it, would you consider using them for a price feed too?
Yeah, I think so. Especially if there's like the existing price feeds don't support it, and the logic for how it operates is sound. Like it can be understood by a team's, by their security auditors. They get comfortable putting it in the trust assumptions and saying we think it'll probably work, but you know, at the end of the day, no guarantees. It's down to the AVS to do it.
It's a very productive BD outcome for a panel.
Yeah, it's unfortunate my cab was so late because my talk was actually about sort of how oracles are being unbundled in a lot of ways across, you know, as products move more from like pooled models to isolated or vault models. In those models, you have much more specialized oracles based on what's in the, you know, you're not getting protocol-wide purchasing of oracles. You're getting like per cluster of assets purchasing of oracle, and that like opens up the space for being a lot more efficient with some of the guarantees the oracles give. But maybe, you know, since we have a minute left, it'd be great to hear some of your predictions of where restaking is in 5 years. And so I'll start with my crazy prediction, which is restaking will drive more monetary premium to Ethereum than rollups will in 5 years.
I would say that rollups will drive the monetary premium to Ethereum through restaking, through the use of restaking.
Fair. Any other? Who else?
Restaking will be the new centrality meme. We put it all into Eigenlayer, and now we have to make sure Eigenlayer doesn't fail. So everyone, instead of chain.
Hey! Felix is like sitting there waiting to respond to this.
Yeah, my 5-year prediction is restaking will be in protocol for Ethereum.
Oh wow! Okay. So this is your Justin Drake. You know, there's the poly market for Justin Drake. What he's going to present tomorrow. Maybe that's.
It's gonna be my bet. Yeah.
Dark horse. Yeah, there is one, but I think all the options are just like faster block time, you know, larger blocks, whatever, boring. So this one is a big. Back. Yeah. This is a big. I feel like this one should be on there. Yeah, this is the next DEF CON. Any other predictions?
In the next 18 months, I think there'll be 20 AVSs that are valued over $1 billion.
What do you think the fees are generated from the 20 AVSs of $1 billion?
MEV.
Well, how much like dollar value? Just an aggregate.
You're asking how much token value?
Well, I said dollar value. Choose a numeraire. You want to choose ETH value, fine. But like just some notion of what the revenue these things generate together is. Like your guess for.
My perception is, I look at the Eigenlayer inflation rate right now at 4%. We need to make that make sense with AVS rewards distributed to restakers. So what is it? Let's say, I don't know what ETH is at today. but I think it's anywhere between like 60 and $80 million of rewards distributed on an annual basis. I think that's a very doable bar with the companies that we're seeing come out.
So an average of 4 million revenue per AVS in the 20 AVS bundle.
Like, can they
18
inflate
months.
their
Got it.
token? Can they inflate their token or just pure?
Yes, they can do whatever the hell they want.
Okay, good then.
Depends on
Well,
the market.
I'm just trying to get an idea for this because one thing that's funny to me, and I know we're done, so sorry for going over, is that people always talk in AVS land about how revenue that these services have to generate on day one, and then I look at rollups and like no one ever asks what the revenue is. They're just like, oh, like sequencer fees, and then you go look at the sequencer fees of the 5th largest rollup, and it's like, that is an exponential decay. That's not power law. That's like going to 0. Whereas in AVSs, I feel like people have a harsher standard, which maybe is a good thing, but I do feel like $4 million.
Well, they're presenting it. It's presented as like the next iteration of what is coming, that people are actually need to generate revenue. And I think this is like incredibly important, regardless of if it works or not in the space. Is like, I truly believe that there are AVSs that are going to generate real revenue, and I think the realistic question is, are they going to use their revenue, or are they going to launch a token and use that and inflate that token basically to pay the rewards instead, right? So my perception is that makes more sense in my brain because of where the market is and what people want, and I think they'll be able to provide more rewards. But we had 3 AVSs come out this week that are not launching a token. They've told us they're not launching a token. They're going to pay out in USDC and ETH. I just think that those are going to be relatively few and far between, just given the fact that it is more difficult to attribute value and attract those restakers with that kind of model.
How much revenue oracles generate?
From restaking oracles or overall?
Oracles today, oracles in the past 5 years.
Yeah, it's true. If I ignore link token appreciation and pit token appreciation, it's like negligible probably. Yeah, that's true.
I would say there's probably 300 to 400 million in existing revenue that could be moved onto AVSs currently across like proving, sequencing, and middleware. And I'd say that I do agree with Luke's prediction that it would be realistic to expect like a quarter of that over like 12 to 18 months.
Cool. Well, you guys heard it here first. I know we drifted from oracles, but I think to me this is a very interesting answer. And so with that, I'll close the panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.